Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside View. My name is Cory Burnell and I'll be your host for this program. And we have a very special guest joining us today, our U.S. Representative, Tom McClintock. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us again.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, you bet. It's really our honor to have you here, and we know you're doing excellent work. Really the Lord's work, you might say, in D.C. So,
very grateful to the people of the district to give me the privilege of speaking for them in Washington.
You bet. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule here while you're on recess to join us and cover some various topics. And for our viewers, this will be our first episode of 3, so we'll get to spend a lot of time with our Congressman today. On the first episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the border crisis and what's going on with immigration and potential immigration reform, of course, building of the wall down there and the funding for that. So why don't you give us kind of your take on progress and how you see things at the
progress has been very slow, largely because so much of what the president is trying to do has been struck down by lower federal court judges, and all of that then has to go through the process. The problem is that those who are for open borders immediately go judge shopping. They find a left-wing activist on one of the federal courts, usually in California, and get an order to block those actions, and then it takes years to go through the courts. We did get one victory on the president's ability to program funding, and that's going to make a major difference. I was with him on Air Force One the day that he tasked General Semonite, the commander of the Army Corps of Engineers, to produce 400 miles of new wall before the end of next year. And in fact, he looks at him and says, "Now you're a lieutenant general, right?" "Yes, sir, I'm a lieutenant general." He says, "If you don't get this wall done in time, you're going to be a lieutenant." So, he was very serious. So, at least having that power restored to the president has made a big difference. But the fundamental situation is we don't have a southern border right now. That border has collapsed. More than 1 million people are going to be illegally crossing that border this year and claiming residency in the United States in violation not only of our laws but making a mockery of our asylum laws. Asylum is reserved for people who have been singled out by their government for persecution because of their membership in a group, whether it's a race or a political party or a religion. It is not ever intended for people who simply want to come to America and get a lot of free stuff. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing today. Once you have crossed the border from the government that has singled you out for persecution to another country, you have now achieved asylum. You do not have a right under international law to go through another 3 countries shopping for the one that provides the best stuff for you, and yet that's what's going on. And it is unfair to those who are legitimately seeking asylum in this country. It makes a mockery of our laws, and of course they're then assigned a court date and they never show up for the court date. So I mean, that's where we are right now, and the two things that are absolutely essential to restore the rule of law and to restore the sovereignty of the United States is a physical barrier. They have proven very, very effective wherever they're employed. Israel has had one for years to protect its southern border with Egypt. Illegal immigration into Israel dropped 99% after that wall was completed, so they are very effective. And at the same time, we have to reform our asylum laws to assure that people can't make the mockery of it that we're seeing today.
You bring up a very interesting point that, of course, is not reported in the media, that asylum is achieved when you've left the country of persecution and gotten into another country across the border, right?
And the president has issued an executive order declaring exactly that. And he has gotten now a little bit of cooperation from the Mexican government, and that's helpful too. But those are stopgap measures. What we absolutely have to do is build that wall and reform our asylum laws to assure that they are provided for those who are legitimately claiming asylum. There are 7.5 billion people on this planet. Most of them live in conditions of poverty and violence that does not give every person in those countries a right to come to ours.
Yes, excellent point. Well, now you talked about 1 million people a year crossing the border, and kind of a follow-up question I had for you is that law enforcement generally has characterized the situation on the border as a crisis, and I think you would generally agree with that based on what you've alluded to at this point.
Again, a country
Can you
that doesn't
describe it for us a little bit?
A country that doesn't have borders isn't a country.
Right.
We simply become a vast international territory between Canada and Mexico, both of which, by the way, have borders, enforce those borders, have immigration laws, and enforce those immigration laws.
Unless you want to come through them to the United States.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it is a threat to the very sovereignty of our country. History is screaming this warning at us that countries that either cannot or will not defend their borders simply aren't around very long. Every country has a unique set of principles and cultures and traditions that define it as a country. And because they're all different, they all produce different results. I like to think that we have gotten closest to perfection in this country with all of our flaws in producing the happiest, most prosperous, and most envied country in the history of human civilization. And we welcome those who come to our country with a sincere desire to become Americans, to adopt our founding principles, to adopt our culture and our traditions, not coming here to make our country into theirs, but coming here to become a part of our country. We welcome that. All of our immigration laws are written to encourage that, a process of assimilation. When you come to America, you come because you love this country, you want to be a part of it. That's not what we're seeing today, with foreign flags being raised. You've seen the pictures. They are stunning. And the problem with that is, if you're going to open your borders, and this is what the Democrats have advocated now. I mean, every one of the presidential candidates in one of the debates said they wanted to decriminalize the illegal crossing of the border. Well, that means you have no borders. There is no way to enforce it at that point. They say they're not for open borders, but then they advocate for anyone who illegally crosses the border. First of all, get rid of it as a crime, so it's no longer illegal to cross the border, and you get all sorts of free stuff: free medical care, free legal representation, free education. In California, you're protected as a sanctuary state. After you've committed other crimes in this country, instead of being deported once you've served your sentence, California protects you from deportation and instead insists that dangerous criminal illegals be reintroduced into our communities. This is nuts, and it is suicidal for any nation to pursue these policies, and yet that's what the Democrats are advocating.
You're absolutely right.
And I think the reason is they've completely alienated Middle America. And I think they realize that their only chance of maintaining long-term power is to bring in an impoverished, highly dependent population that is susceptible to every empty socialist promise that they make.
No matter the historical facts that those promises never come to fruition, right? And they only impoverish masses of people.
Yeah, well, ask Venezuela. And look what those same policies are doing to California, Illinois, New York, wherever they're practiced. They produce the same results. California, when I grew up, we called it the Golden State. It truly was. It was a land of opportunity. Now California suffers the highest effective poverty rate in the entire country. We can't make fun of Arkansas or Mississippi anymore. We are at the very bottom in terms of an effective poverty rate, along with among the highest electricity and gasoline prices in the country. I mean, you can go through a long litany of social and political and economic pathologies that socialist policies bring wherever they're introduced. We're seeing it here. We're seeing it in other parts of the country where the left has maintained control for more than a generation. And you can see where it all leads. Just take a look at Venezuela.
Absolutely. Now, you raised something important that's been particularly a hot topic in the recent years here about sanctuary cities, sanctuary states. Now, the president threatened to withhold federal funding and even perhaps to bus illegal immigrants to sanctuary cities. And any of those threats been acted on?
And was blocked by lower courts. But it seems to me to be an absolute no. And again, I think those matters are still working their way through the court system. But it ought to be a no-brainer. If a state is refusing to enforce federal law, why should they be receiving federal law enforcement funds? And meanwhile, you've got counties like ours whose law enforcement agencies and officials are absolutely opposed to these sanctuary policies. Why should they be penalized? Because their state government is in basically open rebellion against the federal government. What I'd like to do is see all of the money that was going to California go to those individual communities like ours here in Calaveras County, where you actually have law enforcement that wants to enforce our laws and wants to be a partner with the federal government to ensure, among other things, the sovereignty of our nation.
Well, let's talk a little bit about immigration laws and the enforcement. So recently, I think it was yesterday, perhaps 680 ICE raided employers in Mississippi, 680 illegal aliens arrested, detained at a National Guard center. Am I accurate in that the process is basically book them and release them and tell them to come back to court, or are they actually going to get deported?
Again, I don't know about this specific situation. There are a couple things involved. One of them was the illegal employment of illegal aliens. Right. That is against federal law. Don't forget, in 1986, when Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform Act, there were two parts to it. Number one, we had about 3 million illegal immigrants then living in this country. He legalized those immigrants. But the deal was, yes, we'll grant amnesty and legalize the presence of the 3 million who've illegally crossed our borders, but we will also secure those borders, and one of the provisions in it was to make it illegal for employers to hire people who have come into this country illegally. Well, that law's gone largely unenforced over the years. Right. My understanding is the recent raid was specifically against those businesses that were thumbing their nose at federal law. So, that's that part of the matter. But the other matter is those who've already gone through the process. They've already had their day in court. They have been ordered by a court after a hearing to leave the country and have refused to do so. So they've already been all the way through the legal process. They have no right to be here. They have active deportation orders pending against them. These are the orders that the president directed be enforced. And yet we had major political leaders, including Hillary Clinton, advising people to ignore those laws. Well, if we're going to do that, then our laws mean absolutely nothing. If we're not prepared to deport those who not only illegally entered our country, have been apprehended, have been ordered to come to court, have had their day in court, have been ordered to leave the country, and they refuse to do so, if we're not going to enforce that order, then our immigration laws mean absolutely nothing. And if our immigration laws mean nothing, our borders mean nothing. And if our borders mean nothing, we're no longer a country. And that's one of the mortal perils that this generation is going to have to deal with. We're going to have to decide, do we want to continue this grand American experiment, or do we want to simply open the borders and declare ourselves an international territory?
Now, the incentive for employers here obviously is the inexpensive labor. That's their incentive for violating federal immigration law.
And of course, they then get a huge competitive advantage over all of those businesses who are obeying the law, who are meeting all of the requirements of the law.
Now, some of our viewers might not be familiar with the E-Verify system, and some states, as I understand, Mississippi included, require all employers to use the E-Verify system. How exactly, do you know anything about how that works and the database
well, I don't know the technical aspects of it, but it's the same as essentially running a credit card. You have
like
a database.
A background check almost.
And again, every time you use your credit card at a store, you run through a system that checks your credit, checks your credit availability, and credits you with the funds. This simply checks your legal status in the country against the national database. I don't know any of the details of how it works, but it's the same general principle.
But they're supposed to use that.
Yeah, and very simply, it gives every employer the ability at no expense expense and very, very quickly to verify whether or not the people that they're employing are actually entitled to be working here.
There you go.
So
they can certainly comply with the law.
We've tried to get, for years, for California to do that. Of course, it won't. We've also been trying to get the federal government to adopt E-Verify as a mandatory part of our labor law.
Oh, okay. Okay, very good.
But that's not going to get through this House of Representatives, unfortunately.
Right. Now, the penalties to employers you alluded to or stated earlier that they're just simply not enforced. So what are some ideas that you've had or proposed in the past that changes you would make to immigration law that maybe would take some of the carrot away from breaking it or impose more of a stick?
Well, we used to do that. Again, this is... We have a vast array of experience of policies that work and don't work, in immigration, and for that matter, every single other field. And we used to have laws that worked very, very well. First of all, when you hear employers say, well, we Americans won't do this work, and you do have a certain reason for saying so. In this moment in history, because of the economic reforms of this administration, we now have one of the lowest unemployment rates in 50 years. There are actually more jobs available than there are people to fill them at the moment. So I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that. However, you've got 1 million people illegally crossing the border this year. How many is enough? I mean, how many employees do you need? But we used to deal with that within a legal framework with the Bracero program. The Bracero program was simply this. Instead of paying thousands of dollars to a drug cartel to smuggle you across the border illegally, you entered on your own 2 feet. You put a deposit down as you entered our country. You were given temporary legal status for 6 months in this country. You had all the protection of our laws. You sought seasonal employment. You worked in the fields. You made good money, and then at the end of that season, you went back across the border. Your incentive for doing so was, of course, you retrieved your deposit plus interest. And then you had the right to return to our country the next year through the same process. That system worked. It worked extremely well, and we abandoned it. So once we've secured our borders, bringing back the Bracero program, and at the same time, again, we have the other problem, and that is a lot of people who were illegally brought to this country as infants and children who are not legal residents of our country, and yet the only memory they have is of our country. That's the DACA program. At some point, those people are going to have to be, their status is going to have to be normalized. But we can't do that until we've secured our borders. If we do that before we secure our borders, we simply encourage another wave of illegal immigration to bring children across the border in an expectation that 10 or 15 years from now, they too will be granted legal status.
What was the origination of the DACA program? Was that in the Obama administration?
Yeah, that was strictly by fiat by Barack Obama. And by the way, it's been held unconstitutional by the courts. The president has ordered the end of it. Obama had no legal authority to do so. Authority over immigration law is strictly in the Constitution reserved to the Congress. He has to have a law that he signs before he can do that. He didn't do that. He just made stuff up out of thin air. Right. That's been struck down now, and the president has said we're ending this, and we're now going to have to get a compromise whereby we can normalize the status of these people who were in the DACA program, but at the same time assure we don't have a new generation being illegally brought across the border in expectation that they too will get that privilege within a generation.
Now, there are still National Guard troops down on the border helping, obviously, with building the wall and military building the wall, but also helping maintain a presence there, right, for surveillance.
They're not allowed to do law enforcement, but what they do is to relieve our Border Patrol officers so that they can focus on law enforcement. Unfortunately, though, this enormous wave of illegal immigration and a huge spike in children being brought across the border illegally means that our Border Patrol is now, a lot of their attention is focused on simply caring for this population rather than enforcing the law as they're supposed to.
And consequently, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas sent, I think, an additional 1,000 National Guard troops down to the border just maybe this season, this summer.
I'm not aware of that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, he's certainly been on the front line of this battle for a long time. So now, you mentioned a court victory as far as funding of the wall. I think it was 2.2 or 2.8 billion of Pentagon funds that had been given to the Pentagon. The court said, "Yep, you go ahead and redirect those toward the wall." Huh?
Which, by the way, is longstanding law. That was authority given to the president way back in 1977 to declare an emergency and to reprogram unappropriate. Let me rephrase that. Unobligated military funds to measures of higher defense priority. And I can't think of a higher defense priority than the security of our own border. Right. And yet that authority has been used many times over the years by presidents to declare a national emergency because of civil unrest in Bangladesh, for example. Never challenged, never questioned. When the president uses that same authority to secure our own border in one of the most serious national security threats our country's ever faced, well, suddenly all hell breaks loose. And that's, again, something that the American people are going to have to ask themselves, what road are we going to go down? Are we going to be a country organized around the founding American principles that Abraham Lincoln said was the last best hope of mankind on this earth? Or are we simply going to throw all of that away, open our borders, and stop enforcing our laws? That's what the left is advocating. That's what the left is doing. And it will be absolutely fatal to our country if it goes on much longer.
Yeah. Now, can you teach us a little bit about some of the reasons why the wall's designed that it is, the specs behind that determination? I mean, it looks like it's very tall. Do we need something that tall? I mean, what I'm getting at is the expense of the wall. Certainly things are put out to bid, I'm sure, and all sorts of considerations.
That is one question. Actually, the total amount that the president had available to reprogram was about $4.6 million. And using
4.6 billion, right?
Billion,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
Using the same specs as the Israeli government used to build its wall, that should be enough to cover the entire border.
Okay.
It's not. It's only a fraction of the amount that's necessary. And the question you raise is an important one. I don't know the answer to it. I don't think there is an acceptable answer. Why is it that's costing us so much more? Now, obviously, in some cases, you've got land that has to be acquired, so you've got those costs. Some of the terrain is completely impassable. I've flown over it by helicopter, and I never believed that there was terrain that was actually impassable until I saw some of the terrain on our southern border. But so you don't have to cover the entire border. You have to cover most of it, though. You have to acquire private land. That's going to run up the cost some, but that still doesn't explain to me why we can't do what Israel did with the money that we have available to us already.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I would think that Israel, the size of Israel, it just would be so many fewer miles, but is that not really the case?
Well, no.
What we actually need to cover?
What I'm saying is per mile. Per mile,
oh,
they
okay,
did.
Got it.
If we were spending per mile what Israel had spent on its southern border wall, which again was 99% effective in stopping illegal immigration, we could cover our border for about what the president has available to him, about $4.6 billion.
Well, when you talk about the effectiveness of a wall stopping immigration, I could chuckle at Jim Acosta's video when he was down on the border and see nobody's crossing the border.
Yeah.
Look at this
wall. What's the crisis? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
And when we talk about the wall, there are some areas that are state of the art. Acosta was at one of them, but most of them, the wall that's currently in place is not nearly as effective as a backyard fence. In fact, in some places they're lower than backyard fences. In some places they're not fences at all. They're simply vehicle obstacles. You can walk right around them. You can't drive a vehicle across, but you can walk right around them. So, one of the criticisms is, well, the president's just replacing existing walls. Well, yeah, he's replacing existing walls that, again, aren't any more effective than a backyard fence and putting up an impenetrable barrier.
Yeah. What type of credit would you give to essentially the president's negotiating tactics or style to bringing Mexico to the table on some of these, some of their cooperation with regard to immigration control. Should he receive some credit for how he's handled that situation?
Well, I think the jury's still out on that.
Okay.
We have seen some lethargic, some half measures being taken by the Mexican government to begin to reduce this enormous wave of illegal immigration that they've been allowing to pass through their country unrestricted. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean there has been progress. I think the Mexican government deserves a little credit. I think our president deserves a great deal of credit for bringing them to do that. Mm-hmm. But we still are seeing an influx. It's down. I think at the peak was over 100,000 a month. It's down to I think 70,000. But again, don't forget it's also the height of summer. We saw a big surge in the spring. We're expecting another big surge in the fall. I think it's the fall where we'll know whether or not the Mexican government is actually sincerely attempting to assist us in stemming this wave of illegal immigration. Don't forget, they are also impacted by this. Their communities along the border are impacted by these waves of illegals, and they don't like it either. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it did cross my mind. What's the cost that they're experiencing, and shouldn't that really light a fire under them to act?
Yeah, a very good question. I have seen the cost of illegal immigration to this country estimated in the $100 billion range. Mm-hmm. And every $1 billion we throw around in Washington is $8 from every family. So we talk about $100 billion of annual costs. That's about $800 coming out of your family's budget to support the illegal population in this country, and we don't even know for sure how big it is. You know, the typical figure you see is 11 to 13 million illegals here, but I believe it was Yale University did a study recently estimating that the illegal population of the country may be as high as 29 million, and nobody knows
10%.
Because yeah, exactly, and so we don't have a firm handle on the amount of crime that's involved and the total costs are involved, because we don't even have a firm handle on the number of illegals in this country. That's what the president was trying to do by incorporating a question on citizenship in the census, at least get some sense of who's a citizen and who's a non-citizen.
Yeah, that's mind-boggling in and of itself, that we can't know whether you can be here legally and then whether you can vote and that type of thing.
Yeah. And that was strictly, I was so disappointed by that Supreme Court decision. That was John Roberts. And it was very odd because he joined the majority in upholding the Chevron doctrine about a month or two ago. The Chevron doctrine basically says that the courts need to give wide latitude to any federal agency administering its own department. Just not to be questioned. Well, that's exactly what the Department of Commerce was doing with the census question. They have the authority, and he even conceded the question is a legitimate question. It's been asked. It was asked on every census from 1820 to I think it was 1950. It's still used on the long form. It is used by other countries routinely. Even the United Nations recommends that a citizenship question be included in a nation's census because that gives them the ability to better monitor international immigration. So I mean, but what Robert said, like a month after saying we should give complete deference to agencies administering their own laws, he turns around and says, well, it's a perfectly legitimate thing for them to request, but I don't like their reason.
Unbelievable.
So
and that's a matter
how
of
do you
law?
how do you interpret that as anything other than a calculated political decision?
Right. Congressman, this has been a fascinating discussion. We just have a few seconds left, so I'm going to let our viewers know this was the first segment of three, our first show of three with the Congressman, so look for the next two shows, and you should be able to find all three of them up on YouTube. So Congressman McClintock will be staying with us. Again, I'm Cory Burnell, and this is Inside View on Calaveras Public Access. Thank you for joining us.